Katherine Heine, welcome to the largest book group in the known universe. I would like to introduce you to fans and readers. Katherine is author of Standard Deviation, a book which Kate and I absolutely adored, and only to be utterly bowled over by her follow-up novel, Early Morning Riser. Most of you already know that because we leapt on you in the shop and forced you to take it home. And the fact that you're here today suggests that you enjoyed it at least as much as we did. Katherine is far better known perhaps in America than in the UK, I would say. And her fiction is published in all sorts of publications, including the New York Times and New Yorker Magazine. It gives us huge pleasure, Katherine, to welcome you today. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.
I would like to suggest to all of you that if you have subjects you'd like us to discuss, if you'd like to pass on any messages to Katherine, use the chat function and I will do my best to insert your ideas and comments as the discussion progresses. But I'd like to start off, I'd like to start at the beginning. Katherine, tell us something about yourself. Tell us about Early Morning Riser. Where did it come from? Where did you start? And why did you start?
Well, it actually started as a failed novel. I was trying to write a novel about a brother and sister who hire somebody to get in a non-fatal accident with their elderly mother because they want her to stop driving. And I couldn't really make that novel work, but the man that they hired was Duncan from Early Morning Riser. And he's sort of the local Lothario and very laid back. And I just really liked writing about him. And I liked this continuing joke that everywhere they go, somebody slept with him. And so I kept him and I started over. And I wanted, in the new book, I wanted it to be told from the new woman in his life who would have to deal with all these, legion of ex-girlfriends. So weirdly, even though he's not the main character, it sort of started with Duncan.
And if Duncan started it, Jane quickly comes into it. How did you develop Jane?
Well, I was really just in the very, very early stages of it. And my son's third grade teacher told me that that their house, the house next to theirs, was being investigated for growing and selling marijuana. So the DEA came and kicked down her door by accident. And so they called her at school, and she and her husband, who were also a teacher, had to go home and deal with the DEA, and it was pajama day. So they had to do it in their pajamas. And that made me so happy. I just decided really spontaneously that Jane would be a teacher. And the joke about pajama day is in there, although in a very different form. And it was a really random decision, but the classroom scenes wound up being like my favorite ones to write, I think.
And you also write compellingly. You create a setting, a town that, as an American reader, I found compelling and very realistic. I wonder, is Boyne City wholesale out of your imagination? Is it someplace you've lived?
It's a real place. And I grew up in Michigan, and my family always went on vacation in northern Michigan. And then we moved around a lot. And when my sons were like 2 and 4, maybe even younger, we bought a house in Boyne City. And so they would have like a more stable thing for every summer. And I'd never lived in such a small town before. And actually, when we bought the house, we were living in London. And so coming to Boyne City for the summer was this kind of culture shock. And the first year that we lived there, we didn't have Wi-Fi. And so every evening I would tiptoe over to my neighbor's house and stand outside and hook onto his Wi-Fi with my phone and check my email. And after like the third day, another neighbor was like, why are you always going over to Ralph's house in your nightgown? And I was like, oh, it's not London, it's a small town. It's, things are different here. And then, you know, my sons took their first steps there. They learned to ride bikes there. They learned to drive. They got their first jobs there. And at their first summer job interview, the manager asked them how fast they were on a scale of 1 to 10. And my older son thought about it, was like a 5, maybe a 5.5. And they still hired him, which is like, that's Boyne City in a nutshell to me. It's like, there's the good and the bad of all being so closely connected. But overall, I would say it was really good.
I would have said that in the book, those connections are generally supportive and positive, even if Jane doesn't always, especially at the beginning, doesn't always see it that way. I wonder if we could talk a little bit more about Jane and Duncan, who is, of course, the love of her life, but also limits her life in many ways. And he has an irresistible attraction for women, apparently. And I wonder, that has certain effects on her life as well. And was that at the beginning? Did you hit on that? What would you call it? A dynamic as part of the plan, or did that develop organically as you wrote?
I wanted to show Duncan in sort of many stages of life as a single man and a divorced man. And I guess you never see him as a single man, but a divorced man, and then as someone else's boyfriend, and then as a husband and a father. And for me, Duncan was totally redeemed by his love for Jimmy and his treatment of Jimmy. And I think in many ways, Duncan is a more generous person than Jane, or than a lot of people would be. But it became Jane's story, and I knew she wanted to marry Duncan from very early on in the book. And I wanted to make that happen under circumstances that were not the normal reason people get married, that were a little forced. So I wanted her to get the thing that she wanted most in an unusual way.
And you structure the book so that moment comes virtually exactly at the halfway point, when we're teetering between I guess you would say their single life together and their marriage, and it is part of a series of adjustments Jane has to make, I guess, that her romantic ideas don't develop, even though she gets to marry him. I wonder, I have heard some people discuss Duncan as being attractive and charming, but also quite selfish. And I mentioned the relationship with Jimmy. I wonder where the relationship with Jimmy springs from.
It was totally arbitrary thing of, in the first chapter, Jane has a dinner party that goes not so well, because dinner parties gone wrong are my all-time favorite thing to write about. And I should just write a book that's like one long dinner party. And so when I was setting this dinner party up, I wanted Duncan to bring the guy who worked in his workshop. And since Duncan's workshop is basically teetering on bankruptcy all the time, I knew that the person who worked for him would not be a sort of go-getter. So I decided it would be Jimmy, and that he would have a sort of intellectual disability. And that's the only reason I brought him in. And then he sort of took over the book. Like Duncan, he was just really, really fun to write about.
He's fun to write about. He's also, in many ways, what Robertson Davies would call the fifth business. He's the one that sets a lot of the actions going. And he's also the subject of a lot of different emotions going on around him. Did you approach his, I don't know if you would call it a diagnosis, but he's got some learning limitations. Did you approach those as a device for the novel, or was that part of his character that you wanted to insert and make for him?
It was the latter. It was very, very important to me that Jimmy be a kind man and a decent man and a complex person and really worthy of love, that he would add to Jane's life. I didn't want him just to be defined by his learning disability. And actually, you know, in the first drafts of the book, he's just like, the town calls him slow learning, and that's all the diagnosis that you ever get. But readers were saying they wanted a little more, like a low IQ or something to sort of figure him out. But to me, he was really funny, but he was also really insightful sometimes. And his relationship to Jane's children was very fascinating to me, and to Jane and Duncan in general.
I seemed that a lot of the, I guess maybe you'd call it the arc of the book, has to do with Jane's relationship with Jimmy and her realization in the very last pages about her relationship with Jimmy and the love that she comes to feel for him.
Well, it's sort of a slow reveal in the book because it was kind of a slow reveal to me as a writer. And I remember near the end of the book that I was in the supermarket, which seems so exotic now. Like, I was in the supermarket and I was leaning into the frozen foods thing to pick out French fries. And it suddenly occurred to me that Jane might have wound up being Jimmy's caretaker naturally, even without the incident in the book. And that was such a revelation to me. And it sort of formed the last, you know, that last chapter. But I wasn't writing toward that. It was only something that I realized as I went along.
Because Jane is formed through a lot of guilt. She deals with a lot of guilt, and it's interesting to me to hear you say that she might have wound up as Jimmy's carer, regardless. I suppose with the relationship with Duncan, but she seems corralled into parts of her life through this guilt, and I wonder if that guilt comes in part from her mother, from her upbringing.
When I was first figuring out the book, my husband and I went out for a beer. Once again, this like exotic thing that people used to do. And I was talking about the book and the car accident and that I wanted Jane's mother to be a bad driver. And my husband said, well, what if her mother kills herself? And I was like, that's never going to work. I don't know what you're talking about. I always shoot down my husband's ideas. And then like 2 days later, I'm like, oh, you know, you're really smart. That was a good idea. Because I was like, but what if she kills someone else? That's going to be more interesting. And then that was how the book sort of, the momentum got going, is when I had to figure out how to do those things.
Did you enjoy writing the book? Was it as much fun to write as it is to read?
It really was. The first part is hard because writing is like, you know, a train sort of starting up and things turn very slowly. But the second half, you have this huge amount of momentum and you know the characters so well that basically they just sort of talk and you write it down. I mean, it's still work, but and there's a place near the end of the book where Gary, who's a really bewildered, unobservant character, I wanted him to have a health crisis, but I wanted it to be not something serious and maybe even something that was his own fault. And right when I was writing that very scene, my husband went to play squash and then called me because they had to go to the emergency room because his squash partner was having blurred vision and dizzy spells. And it turned out that his partner, squash partner, was wearing, instead of his squash goggles, was wearing his wife's bifocals. And that's why they had to go. And that just made me so happy. And I felt like the world was helping me write the book. I just put it straight in. It's a weird thing of, and when you talk to writers who are in the final process of writing a book, usually that's all they can talk about. And if you say, how's the weather? They'll be like, the weather in Boyne City, what I'm writing right now, it's stormy. It's a very encompassing feeling.
It's good to know that a husband can be a helpmate in creating a book. As a husband, I'm pleased to hear that. I wonder if we could talk about your research a little bit. Jimmy arose in particular ways, but we've had a question from Lorna Colopy. Lorna, thank you. In Standard Deviation, you give an excellent depiction of living with an autistic child. And where did your inspiration for that come from, and did you do research?
A lot of the inspiration or the research for Matthew and Standard Deviation was not research so much into a child with autism as much it was like just regular children who were having meltdowns. Like I remember my friend Susan telling me that she had to tape a banana back together because she'd broken off part of it and given it to her daughter. And my son did have a meltdown in the supermarket where he bit into a jelly donut. And that was like unexpected. I don't know, like he just screamed the whole place down. And he also used to scream so much at haircuts that we got blacklisted from a place that does children's haircuts. Oh. So I do some research, and there was a lot in Standard Deviation about like where the main character thinks about the people in his family and how they may have had, undiagnosed eccentricities, which I think like as I get older, people that I just thought were quirky, I'm like, wow, that really is an actual, maybe a clinical thing. Like there was a man who used to come to our house and only eat white foods. And I was like, okay, I'm just kind of a pushover, I think. I think another person would be
like about that. But there's a lot in the book that either you're a multi-talented genius, which I'm happy to accept on the face, but even the music, Frida has this remarkable trait that in so many circumstances, she finds a little piece of music to insert that is a kind of editorial comment on what's going on. And it seemed to me that would take a lot of work to find the right piece of music that a mandolin player could insert that way. Do you play music? Is this something you know inherently?
No, not at all. But when I was growing up and we would go on vacation in Northern Michigan, we used to go see this folk singer called Sean Ryan. And it was something that I could do with my parents even when I was a teenager and couldn't stand to be basically in my parents' company for extended periods. And it's something I took my own children to hear him. So he sort of introduced me to a lot of folk music. And then he let me consult him for the book whenever I needed a song. And basically the beautiful thing about folk music is like, whatever you're going through, there's a folk song written like completely about that, not just sort of vaguely about that, but really specifically about that. So I did listen to a lot of music. And there were like 50 songs that I wanted to put in the book, but I couldn't because then there would be a song every like other paragraph. And I thought that would not be fun.
I loved the way you used her facility for doing that to build up to the moment when Jane tells her to stop doing it. And that signifies such an emotional moment, in part because Jane and she share a bond that is really lovely, and is one of the strengths of the book. But interestingly, she's one of the few women who has not slept with Duncan, and I wonder why not? What has why has she never fallen for Duncan's charms?
That's a really good question. I never thought about that. I think because the town, until Frida gets married at age 47, the town really accepted that Frida doesn't have boyfriends. She doesn't have sex. She's just Frida, which is, I think, part of what's living in a small town. The bad part is like people sort of pigeonhole you and then you're stuck there. So it was very fun to write her, knowing as the writer that she would get married and have this very sort of first blush love affair very late in her life, or somewhat late in her life.
I'd like to come back to Duncan, and I wonder what you think the source of his power for women is.
I think that I think he's very good looking and he's very sexy. And I think that probably a lot of women have thought that they would change him, that he would want to fall in love with them and get married. And he doesn't. I think he'd be happy to have a relationship that lasted 18 months for the rest of his life till the woman got bored and moved on. I think he would be totally fine with that. I think he winds up liking the life he has more than that,
but he's not a thought, he's apparently a great lover in certain respects, but he's not a thoughtful man. He has, and I think this is something that we've been discussing. His relationship with Jane has a lot of selfish components. His relationship with Jimmy has a lot of selfless components. And I wonder if Jimmy is if you see Jimmy as his alter ego in some sense, if Jimmy has some elements of Duncan that Duncan is in some sense missing.
I never really thought of it that way, but I do think that Duncan is utterly transparent, and he doesn't promise things he can't do. He doesn't, he's a womanizer, but in a sort of non-predatory way. And I think maybe he gets Jimmy. Like with Jimmy totally, you get what you see also. So I guess that they're sort of similar people to me.
That's really interesting. Liz Chapman has brought in a comment and a question. When Jane was pregnant for the first time and searching for names, I really enjoyed the list of possibilities for girls where she had to avoid all of Duncan's old girlfriends, Anne, Annabelle, Angela, and so on. There seemed to be one name, an important name missing, which is Jane's nemesis and friend in an interesting way, Aggie. Why was that? And she comments, the way Glenn was chosen was very moving and part of making Jimmy part of the new family.
It never occurred to me to put Aggie on that list. But that list was really, really fun to write. And I really like names. So just to sit there and get to like think of names and ways that they would be connected to each other. But Glenn winds up sort of being named after Glenn's Market, which is the supermarket in Boyne City. And there are Glenn's Markets all through Michigan and like several other states. And I got a fan letter a few weeks ago from Glenn, from the Glenn of Glenn's Market, saying that somebody had sent him the book and how much he liked it. And it was just the most exciting thing that ever happened to anybody.
Fantastic. The naming, that scene is extremely moving and is another element of the way guilt plays a part in Jane's life. It is a very moving moment, and that you manage to combine pathos and humor in a mix that is inextricable was remarkable. Adam and Susan Maffei, thank you for weighing in. Of all your wonderful characters, do any of them prompt you to explore them more deeply in another book? Do you think about following up with anyone?
I did want to make the book one chapter longer because I really wanted to watch Glenn and Patrice grow up and do more funny things. They were really interesting to me. And like Patrice and Gary, anytime I had a reason for them to be on page, it was like a gift I gave myself. And there's a meltdown that Patrice has in when they tour the candy factory and they give her a blue teddy bear. And my son was given a pink teddy bear at Berlin Legoland and completely lost it on the German news. And so that was really fun to put in there. And there's also a scene where Patrice has a meltdown and Jane has to lure her back in the car with marshmallows. And I had to do that also.
Straight out of life.
Yeah. And everything that happens to Jane on the horrible field trip is something that happened to me when I went as a parent chaperone, but not all on the same trip.
Okay.
But, yeah.
That's a fairly serious litany, even split up. I loved the two girls and how different they were, and how different Jane's experience of them is, and that that Glenn is the future president and is cool and collected and beautiful, and things will go her way right from the beginning. And Patrice is just going to be different, and the sense that it is somehow in their nature, not the nurture, that it's not a difference that comes out, it's right there from the first moment. I also wonder about food in the book. Food and scenes around food are really crucial. So many of your so many character changes, so many announcements, so much action happens around dinner parties, and you do a great job as speaking as people who appreciate a good food scene. They are great. Do you think about, I mean, you must think about what food is served, how it's served, why that food? How do you pick out the food that you put in?
Well, it drives me crazy when I'm reading a book and they just say like they had pasta for dinner. I'm like, oh, what kind of pasta? I always want to know what people are eating and what people are wearing. Those are like my two big things that I always want to know. And I actually can't cook anything at all, but my husband is a really good cook. He does all the shopping and cooking in our house. So I'm always like, what would you serve here? And he'll like spit out a bunch of ideas. And he's not a writer, so it's great because he just gives me ideas and he never wants to save them for his own books. So it works really well. I don't know, I think people cooking for other people is a really sort of fraught enterprise. There's lots of opportunity for passive aggressiveness and caretaking, and it's just kind of like a microcosm of relationships. Is all boiled down to like what people feed each other.
That is so true, and it's a great way to bring characters together. Like it's a reason for characters to be in the room together, I guess. Deborah Bygrave, thank you for this comment. The way you make Aggie just short of being a real threat to Jane, just an imagined one on occasions, is very powerful. How did you manage to achieve that subtlety where Maggie becomes useful and supportive rather than purely making Jane feel inferior?
Once again, that just sort of happened as I wrote it. I really randomly made Aggie a real estate person in the first chapter, not knowing how much real estate was going to come into the book later. And the relationship between Aggie and Duncan is an interesting one to me because I think that they would say that their relationship is completely neutral and they're just friends. But I think they love to press each other's buttons and they just can't resist it. I still think they're very entangled. I think that Jane is sort of right to be threatened by that. But it's such a small town, they're never going to avoid her. So she just kind of makes the best of it.
The sequence in which Duncan and Aggie go to the funeral and Duncan pushes her buttons is, I think, a really good example of that. And also an example of Duncan not texting, not getting in touch with Jane. Jane doesn't know what's going on. It's Jane who's left out of whatever is going on in a sense. Do you feel the characters are as alive as we all do when we're reading the book? Are they as real to you?
Oh, completely. There was one sentence of dialogue in the book that Aggie said that was not grammatically correct, and the copy editor kept flagging it every time through. And I'm like, I can't change it or Aggie's going to be mad at me. I was like, Aggie said that. I heard her say it and I just wrote it down, but eventually I changed it. But no, they were all very, very real to me. And near the end, there's a scene where Duncan and Jane's mother are on the patio after supper, and the mother tells Duncan about her menopause symptoms. And I remember when I wrote that, like I stopped writing it and ran into the kitchen and was like, listen to this thing Jane's mother said. It was really funny. So yeah, it's very real to me, but I'm a very auditory person. Like I can always hear what they're saying.
Do you read them out loud? Does that help you?
I don't have to. I just can hear it.
The dialogue seemed completely believable. It felt the way I think I hear people speak. And here's Amy Walden. Thank you, Amy. I loved Jane's thrifty nature and what she found beauty in things that were used. Was that done to reflect her opinions of the people she surrounds herself with, as if she needs to make them feel useful?
No, but now I'm going to tell people that's why I did it. We'll pretend I just said that. No, I just really like the thrift store. So I made Jane like the thrift store. And I did like the analogy of, Duncan was somebody else's husband and she wears somebody else's clothes. And there's a feeling of sort of being an imposter in her life sometimes. And there's a scene where Jane thinks about how she types in a search for Challenge Mountain, which is the resale store in Boyne City, and she gets all these hits about what a challenge her daughter is at preschool. And my cousin typed in challenge in a similar way and got all these hits about how her mother was adjusting to life in assisted living. So that was another thing that I was able to put right in. And it just seems like the world helps you a little bit. I keep saying that, but it really does.
It's nice when it happens. I would have guessed from the book that you had taught second grade, but apparently not. Apparently that is simply your observations from from helping your children's school out. And did you talk to teachers? Did you do any kind of research, or is it completely off the cuff?
I did interview my son's second grade teacher, and she was really helpful about some specific classroom things that, routines that they have in classroom and how that works. And, but I was always, we were talking about this earlier, I was always like the party planner in one of my children's classes and the art lady in the other class. So I always went into their classes a lot. And 7-year-olds are just really, really funny to me because they're pretty articulate, but they can't do anything for themselves. So it's kind of like you're having to help this little adult. I don't know, 7-year-olds are very funny. So when I decided that I could write about them, it just was such a pleasure. And
such shines such a light on Jane. even when she's leaving her list of things for the substitute teacher, when and one of them is one of the children, she pays for the milk for one of the children, that there's a lot going on with her relationship with them that highlights her essential kindness and goodness. And I wonder if that, for me, offsets the feeling that she has to undergo a lot of guilt in other areas of her life, that she's doing something generous and lovely for these children, and there's no sense of guilt. It's all simply part of her character.
I don't think she feels a lot of guilt in the classroom. I think that teachers in general just have such a hard job, and they can't help but get attached to their students and do things for them. I don't know why I'm making this connection, but I guess because we're talking about school, but about a month ago, my younger son graduated from high school and he's going to college in the fall. And he asked me how to use the toaster. It's like, wow, the road to independent living is going to be a long one.
That's it sounds though like he should have asked your husband.
Probably, but don't you think he should know?
I wouldn't want to comment.
I think we failed as parents.
I felt there was a lot going on in the structure of your book, and I don't want to pull it apart like an autopsy, but I wondered whether, when you planned out the chapters and the years that things happen, whether you were simply planning out character development and plot, or if there was some other thing going on in the series of years that you decided that the chapters would be set in. 2002, 2005, 2006, 8, 11, 16, 19. Is there any kind of, were you thinking about a progression, or is it simply, I'm going to let 7 years pass before this next chapter?
It happened as I wrote the book. I keep saying that, and I think of this Stephen King quote where he talks about when you write a book, you get an idea, and then you get another idea, and then you get another idea. And how I always thought that was the least helpful advice ever given. And it frustrated me so much, but that sort of is how it works. And I knew that I had to jump ahead in time in order to get, things to happen. So it was basically, I just picked up the story wherever I thought the funniest, most interesting part was going to be. And originally, I finished the book in 2019, but I set it to finish in 2020 because I was like, years are all the same. It's what is going to change? Why can't it be set in 2020? And then, of course, I had to go back and rejigger everything.
Did you know where the book was going? Did you have a sense of an ending when you were writing the early part?
Yeah, after the first chapter I was sort of figuring it out, but after that, then I sat down and planned everything ahead but not in a super, I just knew what was going to happen in each chapter, but not the details of it.
So in your view, was the plot more important or the characters?
Well, my first book had no plot. So, and in fact, I remember when I turned in Standard Deviation and my editor wrote her first email about the revisions, she was like, I have some ideas how to bring the plot forward. And I was like, what plot might that be? I'd love to know. So for me, Early Morning Riser seems so heavily plotted. But I think that's just to me. Is it Dickens who said that plot is an embarrassment? Which it is, but you need it.
If he didn't, he should have.
Yeah.
I believe your first book was short stories. And,
yeah, they didn't have plots either.
And do you think, is that just part of you that plot is not part of your writing?
I think it's something that I've learned to do more. as I get older and become a stronger writer, it used to be that if something funny happened to me, I wrote a story about it, but the whole story would be like, shortly before the pandemic, I was at the dog park, we have dogs, and this man at the dog park gave his dog a 10-minute warning, and he wasn't being like ironic or playful. And I think when I was 25, I would have written a story and that would have been the whole story. Like, this girl goes to the dog park and this funny thing happens. And I think as I get older, I'm seeing more how to make connections between other things and actually have something happen in the stories.
Well, I for one, and many readers here in East Sussex and around the UK are really looking forward to whatever you write next, plot or no plot. I wonder, besides the writing, you're also a reader. And I wonder, as a bookseller, I would love to know what you're reading and what you're enjoying.
Exciting Times by Misha Dolan was like the book that got me through the original lockdown. It's so funny, it's so good. And then there's Brood by Jackie Polson, which is, if somebody said it's about chickens, that would make you not want to read it. And I don't know how she ever sold it, with her agent being like, it's about chickens, and it's great. But I seriously, I had to go to bed early every night because I was so jealous. It was so good. And then I just read The Night She Disappeared by Lisa Jewell. And it was fantastic. And I'm friends with Lisa Jewell on Facebook. So I sent her this message saying, like, I don't know if anyone's ever told you this, but you're really good at suspense. And then I thought, and then I sent, that's a joke. And then I was like, the part about maybe nobody's ever told you is a joke. You are, like, I just kept going and going. It was one of those things where, like, once my son asked me to write him an email to his teacher and was like, but don't try to be funny. And I was like, I am funny. You're gonna have to deal with it.
I suppose trying to be funny is kind of a thing. Well, I would like to say from Much Ado Books, on behalf of my wife and myself, thank you so much. Thank you for being so funny. Thank you for being so natural. Thank you for bringing us a book that has brought us so much pleasure. And I've got some people here echoing this. I've got, thank you so much, Janice. Loved Early Morning Riser. Jan Boys, loved the book. It's been a delight to hear you. Deborah Bygrave, thank you. Great book and very good to hear your conversation. Thank you. Thank you so much. Everybody, I think I'd like to suggest everybody unmute yourselves just for a moment and raise your glass in toast to Katherine Heiny. Katherine, thank you so much. So appreciate having this chance to talk to you. So enjoy your book. We love sharing it with people. It is a highlight of our book selling year.
I have to say, my husband brought me a cup of tea right before this started, and it's a Hooters mug.
Nice.
So, thank you, everybody, for being here. So cool.
Thank you. Good luck.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye. End the meeting now.